We're going to keep moving to keep on track, and our next speaker is Alan Rubel, who is the assistant professor in the School of Library and Information Studies and program in legal studies at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Alan is actually much older than he looks, much wise and equally wise, and he is the author of many peer-reviewed books and many peer-reviewed articles, and was a senior advisor to the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethics on the privacy and progress in whole genome sequencing study that they published. And so we have asked Alan to give his take on the ethical and privacy issues related to genomics.
Thank you. See if I can get this. Does that work well? Thanks. And I should just be able to go, there we are. So first, let me thank the Center for inviting me and do a little bit of a disclaimer, a different sort of disclaimer. My training is in philosophy, my PhD is in philosophy, I'm also a lawyer, and I work in kind of legal and moral and social, political, philosophical issues surrounding privacy and intellectual property and related issues. So when I talked to John and Rich about coming down here, and they told me that it was a presentation for the Center for Practical Bioethics, I paused over that and said, if you looked at my CV, I'm a philosopher by training, and maybe it's not so practical. I won't give practical advice about particular cases. They said, no, that's fine. So a little bit of a disclaimer there. Now, what I want to do, in addition to thanking the Center, I want to thank Stephen and Misha for setting up my talk really, really nicely. There's a couple of things that came out of both of those talks that'll save me a lot of work in setting up a couple of points that I want to make. And I'll get to those in a moment. But before I do that, I want to ask a question. I want you to ponder. I'm not going to do like I do with my undergraduates and make you raise your hands or anything. But I will ask you to ponder a question about something that Misha brought up in the publishing of the entire genome from Henrietta Lacks, right? And as he presented it, and I think he's absolutely correct, that it seems to be a problem that was published without the consent of the Lacks family. And I assume it strikes a lot of people here as problematic, right? Do I get a little bit of assent to that? Okay, yeah, it strikes. And the reason is that information has important implications for the Lacks family and descendants. Is that a fair reading, Misha?
Sure.
Yeah.
I would just emphasize that no laws were broken.
Yeah, no laws were broken, absolutely. I'm a lawyer, but right now I don't care about whether any laws are broken. But it does seem at least important from the standpoint of not having their consent. But it's curious to me, and this is the philosopher coming out, why the consent of the Lacks family at this particular moment tells us anything about whether that's a justifiable thing to do from the perspective of people who come later. Right? Why? I mean, it matters maybe for them, but it's problematic to consent to that publication of that information if it affects a lot of other people. They can't consent. Surely I can't consent to things that will affect my descendants. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I want to get to in this presentation. I want to push back, not actually push back, but I want to push on a couple of key concepts and a couple of key moral issues surrounding consent and agreement to genomic sequencing. So, what am I going to do? I'm going to start by looking at this publication that Rich mentioned, Privacy and Progress in Whole Genome Sequencing. I was fortunate enough to be asked to be a senior advisor for a few months last year while the commission was working on this. And I have no current affiliation, and I can't speak for the commission, but it's a really nice publication. It brings up several things that I think will be useful to draw upon in the later part of the talk. I will look at some key features from that publication. Then I'm going to look at some justifications for key recommendations. And then I'm going to push back on it. And then I'm going to ask some what I think are hard questions. Maybe y'all think they're easy. I would doubt it, but I think they're hard and interesting. So some conceptual moral questions surrounding autonomy, consent, and privacy, which is a trio of important concepts that surround the issues that we're talking about today. And finally, I'm going to make a short argument that maybe we don't really care about privacy. Now, or maybe what we care about is a little deeper than privacy, and privacy is actually a proxy for some other goods that are really at issue. And maybe you'll believe it, maybe you won't, but I think it's at least plausible and worth considering. So, privacy and progress. Now this is where Misha and Stephen have really done the work for me. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I want to get the broad picture of things, of ideas that I'm going to draw on in the next little while. What's the state of affairs with respect to whole genome sequencing? Well, there's increasing availability and decreasing cost of whole genome sequencing that I think Misha and Stephen both brought up very clearly. I won't draw on that anymore. Moreover, there's enormous potential and increasingly realized research and clinical benefits of whole genome sequencing, but we don't know what will come of it. Right? It's just, as Stephen mentioned, it's just starting to be tapped, and there's a lot more to come. And here's an important corollary, in my view. The potential costs to individuals are also largely unknown. If the inferences that we're going to be able to make from whole genome sequencing and related research and clinical work is unknown, well, if that information could redound to the detriment of individuals, either whose genomes are sequenced or their relatives, well, that's unknown too. So we don't actually know the ways in which people might be negatively affected down the road. So this is a large unknown. I don't think that should be controversial. I think that's true. It may not be a big problem, but it's at least worth considering. And finally, another background fact with respect to that's, I think, made very clear in Privacy and Progress, and I think is really some of the best work that's in there, I had nothing to do with it, is that there are piecemeal and incomplete legal protections for genetic privacy. Misha brought this up some with respect to HIPAA, but there is, in fact, one very important federal law, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which prohibits discrimination in health insurance and in employment based on genetic information. But there's not a lot else, specifically with respect to genetic information, and very little that regulates, say, law enforcement use of genetic information. And when there's lots of DNA being sampled and sequenced and stored by law enforcement security agencies, and there's not so much in genome sequencing and genomic research done in purely private enterprise. So piecemeal and incomplete legal protections for genetic privacy. Now, getting to the Commission's recommendations. I'm not necessarily endorsing these, and I can only talk about a couple, but I want to point them out because they're going to draw on the concepts that I want to look at later in the presentation. So, if you have, many of you have probably seen this publication, but there's several recommendations that are in the front of the report, and those are explained in further detail throughout the report. But I'm just going to quote a couple of these to get a sense of where I'm going. So first, the Commission urges federal and state governments to ensure a consistent floor of privacy protections covering whole genome sequence data, regardless of how those data were obtained. And those policies should protect individual privacy by prohibiting, this is where it gets interesting, by prohibiting unauthorized whole genome sequencing, so without the consent of the individual from whom the sample came. So the worry here is not about sequencing per se, but it's about unauthorized sequencing. That is, whatever sequencing should occur, is to be authorized by the individual. Fair enough. Recommendation 3.2 discusses informed consent forms in whole genome sequencing. Informed consent forms should briefly describe what it is, state how the data will be used in whatever study is going on, and to the extent feasible, how the data might be used in the future. That's a key one here. How, the extent feasible, how the data might be used in the future. And 3, explain the extent to which the individual will have control over future data use. Define benefits, potential risks, and state that there might be unknown future risks. And 5, state what data and information, if any, might be returned to the individual. Right? So there's several things in that the Commission recommended. Again, I'm not speaking for the Commission. I'm not endorsing this per se. I'm just setting out as an important exemplar of the role of how consent and authorization is being used in whole genome sequencing. Now, what are the underlying principles? Well, the Commission draws on a number of principles in several publications. They outline very clearly, I think, what principles they're drawing on: respect for persons, public beneficence, responsible stewardship, intellectual freedom, responsibility, democratic deliberation, justice, and fairness. I care here about respect for persons. That is, I want to focus in on respect for persons, especially as it relates to privacy, autonomy, and consent. Now, what are autonomy and consent? Remember I said I was trained in philosophy, and when you do these things, you stop and go sometimes painfully slowly and try to describe what concepts we're trying to get at when we're dealing with moral and ethical questions. Well, what do we mean by autonomy? Well, autonomy roughly is the ability to govern oneself and make important decisions according to one's own reasons and values as one sees fit. I think this is a fairly plausible definition. There's lots of questions about the degree to which people actually act autonomously. There's lots of questions about the degree to which autonomy ought to override questions of consequences or benefits. But it's important, and I think it's probably so intuitively obvious that we don't often think about what it actually means, but it's worth pausing here for a second. And the idea is that each of us is able to decide for his or herself what matters. We can decide whether we value particular things to do in life, whether we value particular relationships, whether we value particular life paths, whether we value particular spiritual pursuits or avocational pursuits or what have you, right? And we can guide our lives accordingly. We can make decisions on, especially important decisions, on the basis of those values. And that's sort of a rock bottom ethical precept. And consent, and all of you deal with consent, so I'm probably saying things that are fairly obvious here, but I want to be clear about them before we get to other stuff. Consent is, at least in philosophical terms, roughly autonomous authorization. Consent is not, I think in a moral sense, it's not mere agreement, right? Because we can agree to things that we don't actually personally endorse. We can agree to things under coercion. We can agree to things in a way that don't actually implicate or do not actually instantiate our autonomy. For example, if we don't have sufficient information. Right? Informed consent is the paradigm of consent, and the reason information is important in consent is because a person can determine whether or not a particular decision actually comports with whatever values that person wants to incorporate into his or her decisions, right? That's, again, fairly plausible, but useful to pin down here. Now, privacy and autonomy. Privacy, so a theme to what I'm talking about here today is going to be something like who cares? Who cares about privacy? Why should we care about privacy? And in light of why we should care about privacy, how ought we think about genomic sequencing? Well, one answer might be we care about privacy because we might be harmed by results. Right? We might care that if we don't protect, say, medical information, people will be less likely to receive care. We might, Misha brought up a study by Kaufman et al., who are at Johns Hopkins. They talked about how that study, along with several other studies, have indicated that where people do not have privacy protected, they may be less likely to participate in clinical trials. And we might say, well, the research process will be hindered if people can't be assured of privacy in the information that results. Okay, but here's the thing. We might get people to receive medical care or participate in clinical trials or medical research of whatever sort if we simply lied to them and failed to disclose to them that they really could not expect privacy. right? Then those consequences would be realized, right? They might get the benefits of visiting care providers, or we might all get the benefits of research trials, and we're all better off. But that's problematic because it impinges individuals' privacy, right? They may value having medical privacy, and if they're deceived about the extent to which their privacy is actually protected, then that's a problem, not because of bad consequences, but because they've had some sort of impingement on their autonomy. Now, privacy can be both an object of autonomous choice and a condition of autonomous choice. What do I mean by that? Well, we might like to have a degree of privacy. We might like being able to not have others know certain things about us. We might like not having the NSA gather information about the metadata in our phone calls. We might like it if the NSA, even though they gathered that metadata from our phone calls, did not share that information with the Drug Enforcement Agency or what have you, right? We might really like that, but just because we're private people, not because we might be harmed, but we might like it. Right? So that's relatively straightforward. But more importantly, for our purposes here, privacy can be considered a condition for autonomous choice. Now, Rich mentioned that I work in an information school and a legal studies program, and a lot of what people care about there, or one important area of controversy, is the ability of government actors or others to learn about people's intellectual habits. So many of you know about Patriot Act Section 215, which allows for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to make records requests and not reveal those records requests to people who've had their business records requested. Librarians, for one, and others objected strenuously to this on the grounds that people need a sense of security in their personal information, a sense of privacy, in order to act autonomously with respect to their intellectual endeavors. So, if you knew, and if you internalized, that your library browsing habits, or your book purchasing, or your online reading habits were directly scrutinized, you may be less likely to actually instantiate the things that you value in your intellectual choices. You might sort of think of the person reading over your shoulder and exercise your intellectual choices differently. That means that privacy isn't necessarily an object of autonomous choice. It's not just something you want, but it's a condition for you to be able to fully instantiate the things that you value in the important things that you do. Now, we'll get back to genomic information in a minute, but I just want to make that distinction between object of autonomous choice and condition of autonomous choice. Now, it's relatively unproblematic for people to consent to losses of or risks to objects of autonomous choice. Right? I autonomously choose to play the guitar. I like it. It's something that I carve out a little bit of time in my life to do. And maybe I don't do other things as a result, but I can give that up, right? I can agree to, for example, go on a business trip for a week or more, not play my guitar for a week, right? I can trade that away for some opportunity, right? That makes sense. We do it all the time. A lot of us like to have a little money in our pockets. We trade that away for other things that we want. No problem here. However, the degree to which individuals can, at least morally, consent to losses of or risk to conditions for autonomous choice is more difficult. What do I mean by that? The lawyers among you are no doubt very familiar with this in different forms, but let me raise an intuitive case. Suppose that you enter into an employment agreement, you want to work for some organization or some body. They might include, hopefully they don't, but they might include a provision that says you will agree not to engage in your normal religious practices. Or you will agree not to make public pronouncements of any sort. you might agree to, or they might ask you to do that. Now, surely you can enter into such an agreement. It's not incoherent to say that you might agree. You might actually nod in assent to such an agreement. But many of us, and I think it's plausible, I think it's true, I also think it's plausible, that that would be morally unconscionable. Right? It's morally unconscionable to be able to curtail the conditions of your own autonomy in particularly important areas. Right? So it might be morally problematic in certain cases. Now consider another case, another possibility. You could enter into some sort of agreement that would relinquish, give up your right not to be treated badly, not to suffer because of your, say, spiritual or religious beliefs, your political views, or your race or ethnicity, or something like that, or the groups with which you agree to consort. Right? You might say, yeah, in order to get this job, in order to enter into this relationship, I will, never sign off on it. I will never agree to file a civil complaint for racial or ethnic discrimination or gender discrimination or something like that. You could relinquish that. But the problem with that, we might say, and I think it's plausible, I think it's true, I think you'll think it's at least plausible if you don't think it's true, that that would be such a severe curtailment of one's ability to act within the modern world that it would be unconscionable to allow that kind of agreement to have legal effect. It seems totally plausible to me. Now, why is that? Well, the why is that allowing oneself to have one's ability to enter into, ability to exercise one's spiritual or religious affiliations or beliefs, or to not be discriminated against on the basis of those beliefs or race or ethnicity or something like that, is such a severe curtailment of a person's ability to act, to function in the world, to instantiate one's values, and to act autonomously that we couldn't morally brook such a curtailment. So the degree to which we, and I think that's an instantiation of this third principle, or this principle that I have, this idea I have up on the slide, is that the degree to which we can actually consent to losses of a risk to conditions for autonomous choice are deeply problematic. Now, let's get back to genomic sequencing. To what extent is it plausible that persons can agree to risks to loss of opportunity in financial or employment, loss of opportunities financially or in terms of employment, in terms of the opportunity to have positions of responsibility or enter into relationships? That is, to what degree could we possibly consent to certain losses of opportunity? Well, I think that such losses, if we were to lose out on, say, financial opportunities or employment opportunities or positions of responsibility on the basis of, say, health or genetic information, that is a problem of fairness, a problem of discrimination. Whether that is, and as such, as problems of unfairness or discrimination, they are such losses, such risks are limitations or are constraints on the conditions of individuals' autonomy. That is, your ability to gain financing. Say you're a small business owner, you want a loan in order to put into place some idea that you have. Now, genetic information might be very interesting to people financing you on the grounds that if you have a high likelihood of dying at some point or of having medical complications, it may say something about your ability to actually follow through and make good on the loan conditions. It may be that you might lose out on, say, life insurance or disability insurance, insurances that are not covered under the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, on the grounds of genetic information. That might limit your ability to steer your lives according to your values as you see fit, right? Such unfairnesses or such cases of discrimination, I think, are most plausibly understood as affronts to autonomy. And as a result, they're affronts to autonomy because they're affronts to the conditions of exercising autonomy. Now, this is my view. It's neither morally justifiable nor conceptually coherent that persons can actually consent to such losses. That is, it's neither morally justifiable nor conceptually coherent that persons can consent to risks to the conditions of their exercise of autonomy. Now, it's not morally justifiable for some of the reasons that I've discussed. That is, allowing oneself to be open to unfair discriminatory practice is not morally justifiable. But it's also not conceptually coherent. Why? Because this goes back to issues raised by Stephen and Misha, namely that we don't know exactly how whole genome sequencing is going to play out. What sorts of conditions are going to be found, the degree to which that can be used against people. Hence, the degree to which any sort of consent, any sort of agreement to have one's own genome sequenced or have the effects of that bear upon one's relatives or descendants is the degree to which that's actually informed, I think, is minimal. It's not informed. If we don't know exactly what those effects are going to be, then it doesn't look like informed consent at all, and hence not autonomous authorization. It might be authorization, people might agree to it, but doesn't mean it means it's not autonomous. And that's worrisome. Now, it does not follow that whole genome sequencing itself is problematic. Well, why not? Well, one reason is that there might be just the ability to do this in a relatively unconstrained way may be outweighed by good consequences, right? Problem with that, I won't belabor this because I'm running out of time, that weighs against the principle of respect for persons and the importance of consent in the first place, right? You can always override consent whether good if you were to adopt that kind of principle, you might always be able to override consent on the basis of good consequences. But more importantly, I think that, and this is where I was going to give a short argument. This is the last thing I'm going to claim. It may be that privacy is not exactly what we're after in any of this. Now, Misha brought up a point, and this is another way in which I think he did a really nice job of setting up some important issues, namely that it may be impossible over the long haul to actually preserve a great deal of individual privacy in lots of different ways. Right? It may be impossible with respect to communications. It may be impossible or close to impossible with respect to genetic information. But that may be okay. Or that may be not, or maybe less problematic from the standpoint of individuals being able to act according to their own values and interests as they see fit if the background conditions, the background of opportunities are actually much more robust than perhaps they are now. So the possibility of being denied some employment opportunity or opportunity for advancement on the basis of, say, one's genetic or other health information is less problematic where employment is less, where unemployment is less high than it is now. A tighter labor market, that is where it's easier to get a job, discrimination is much less of a worry. Likewise, where insurance is easier to get or social insurance is much more robust than it is now, then being discriminated against on the basis of genetic information is much less problematic. That is, people might be able to instantiate their values in whatever way they see fit, where background conditions for exercising their autonomy are more stable. So it may not be an issue of privacy at all. So I'll summarize just with a couple of minutes. So there's a tension, I think, what I hope I've at least alluded to enough, is that there's a tension at the intersection of autonomy, consent, and privacy, where potential harms or privacy loss are unknown, important, and affect conditions for autonomy. And resolving that by resorting to consent, as some aspects of the privacy and progress seem to do, is problematic because abandoning the conditions for one's autonomy are problematic, and it may be conceptually incoherent because consent really wouldn't be autonomous authorization where the effects are largely unknown. Consequences, sort of brushing over that, and it may be that a better way to address issues of genetic privacy and potential discrimination or limitations on autonomy is shoring up people's ability to act according to their values as they see fit in other ways, either employment opportunities, insurance opportunities, or other social insurance opportunities. But, now here's the big but, background conditions are hard problems and not really the kind of things that we're able to exercise much control over in our professional lives. What do? We work on IRBs, we work in academic settings, we do research, many of you are clinicians, but addressing the background conditions of insurance or the background conditions of employment are difficult. So the problems of whole genome sequencing may be kind of beyond our ken. That's not a good feeling, but I think that may actually be an important part of what's going on. Thank you.
So I have to admit, I'm not sure I got all of that, but I think what I'd like to do as we move through the day is to come back and kind of probe maybe some of the more practical aspects of your argument, at least their practical implications.